Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight, we're heading straight into the inferno of feudal China, where pain wasn't just a tool of control, it was a form of performance art. In ancient society, especially from the Song dynasty onward, one of the punishments for women accused of adultery was the infamous wooden donkey ride. But don't imagine some adorable donkey going hee-haw. This donkey only knew how to scream, screech, and shred your thighs with sharp wooden spikes standing tall in the middle of the street. In the classic novel Water Margin, Pan Jinlian was punished this way, and Wang Po, the matchmaker who led people into sin, was paraded and then executed by Halingqi, sliced up like a piece of cold meat in front of a crowd. And it wasn't just women. Xian Buhai Han, a Mongol leader, also suffered this punishment, and his death became a flame of vengeance. A flame that his grandson, Genghis Khan, would nurture and later use to burn down an entire Chinese dynasty. And that was just the warm-up act. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Right now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft humming sound. And let's step into tonight's journey together. Feudal laws weren't made for justice. They were there to preserve the social hierarchy. In ancient China, no one actually studied the law. They heard about it the way people hear ghost stories, unseen, but terrifying. Because when the law did show up, it usually came in the form of rope, an executioner, and a parade where you were the main character. Feudal law didn't protect people, it kept them confined, in a rectangular mold. And if you dared to step even slightly outside that mold, you'd be nailed onto another rectangular wooden frame called the wooden donkey. Example, during the Western Han, from 202 before the Common Era to 8 of the Common Era, the 5 punishments law listed the main penalties: facial tattooing, nose cutting, leg amputation, castration, and execution. These punishments mostly applied to commoners. Nobles who committed crimes often had their sentences reduced or were pardoned if they had served the court. The law didn't need to be taught because the people already spread it themselves through cautionary tales. The government didn't hand out citizen manuals or organize legal education weeks. They told stories, stories of a disloyal wife, stripped naked in the street, stories of liars, nailed to a stake. Stories of some woman who was once forced to ride the donkey and screamed so loud that birds flew off temple rooftops. People didn't need to know right from wrong, according to the law. They just needed to know there are certain things that, if you do, you'll lose your seat, except the one on a wooden donkey. Society didn't need surveillance devices. The people were each other's surveillance. Everyone was alert. Everyone was afraid of being implicated. And so, everyone silently watched each other as a form of collective self-defense. Fear wasn't written on paper. It lived in the memory of the crowd. Those who had once witnessed a body dragged through the street, in pain far greater than its sins. Thus, the law became a terrifying fairy tale, where the princess was handed to the dragon not for being too beautiful, but for stepping half a foot beyond traditional morality. And in this barbed wire society, Surviving didn't require intelligence, only silence, lowered heads, and staying far away from anything with wheels, according to records from the later Han Dynasty, from the year 25 to 220 of the Common Era, and reappeared in many folk books during the Ming Dynasty. The wooden donkey punishment was applied in provinces like Henan, Zhejiang, and Sichuan. It wasn't just a means of punishment. It was a symbolic tool of dominance in a patriarchal agrarian society. It didn't bray. It didn't have legs. It didn't eat grass. But it made hundreds of people shiver, step back, or freeze and stare, as if watching a slow-motion accident. People called it a wooden donkey, but really, it was a torture device designed with cruelty and crude mechanical ingenuity. It looked like a wooden box about 1 meter tall, over 1.5 meters long. On top was a thick wooden stake, roughly 2 fingers wide, sticking upright. And that was the soul of this device. The prisoner, mostly women, was stripped naked, tied hand and foot, and forced to sit on the stake. Some places added sharp stones or shards of pottery to enhance the educational effect. Below were 4 wheels. As the wheels turned, the stake would rise and fall, or tilt slightly. Not enough to kill, but enough to rip muscle fiber by fiber and shred any remaining notion of dignity. And they called that executing the sentence. Every wheel turn was a reminder. You were wrong, and you must hurt. But first, people need to see you hurt. In some special versions of this punishment, the wheels were attached to an off-center spindle, a primitive camshaft, making the stake not only rise and tilt, but twist diagonally, creating the sensation that your insides were being wrung out. Some Ming Dynasty descriptions, from the year 1368 to 1644, recorded that after 4 full wheel rotations, the victim usually passed out from pain and blood loss. Many Song and Ming documents describe the procedure vividly. In the morning, the prisoner was dragged into the street, usually a market or city gate. A drum signaled the punishment. The crowd gathered, as if watching a puppet show. There were no lawyers, no defense, just wood, rope, and the curious eyes of the public. You might think, it's just pain, right? But in truth, the real sentence was shame. A woman, bound, naked, seated on a stake. That wasn't the image of justice. It was a dark painting of society itself. There, one person's pain became the machinery that kept the crowd feeling safe. Compared to the West, where gallows or guillotines were built, feudal China didn't need sharp blades or professional executioners. They needed a wooden donkey, a few turns of the wheel, and one person to be humiliated in public. The punishment didn't need to be swift. It needed to last. So everyone would remember, not forget. In feudal China, not everyone measured morality with the same yardstick. Men could be allowed to be wrong. Women could not. Or more accurately, they didn't have the right to be wrong. 3 obediences, 4 virtues. These weren't just teachings. They were invisible chains that bound the lives of millions of women. Before marriage, obey your father. After marriage, submit to your husband. When your husband dies, quietly obey your own son. This so-called female morality sounded like a virtue lesson, but in reality, it was a chilling mechanism of control. And when a woman went off script, the price wasn't just a scolding. It was a wooden donkey, standing tall in the middle of the market, of. Adultery wasn't just betrayal. It was a stain on the honor of the whole clan, the whole village. And so, the punishment had to be painful enough, shameful enough, loud enough for others to stay away. A naked woman dragged through the street was no longer a person, but a moral cautionary tale for public dissection. In official historical records, the real names of women punished by the wooden donkey are rarely mentioned, but some cases survived in books like The History of the Ming or the supplementary records, such as the case of Madame Pung in Shaanxi during the Ming dynasty. Accused of adultery by her husband, she was sentenced by the district magistrate to ride the donkey publicly in the market without further investigation. Her real name wasn't recorded. Only 2 characters appeared on the sentence: adulterous woman. Many famous cases in history recorded only the man's name, the accuser, the judge, the one who condemned, and the woman. She was simply called Jian Fu, adulterous woman. No one asked, why did she commit adultery? No one asked, did her husband beat her, neglect her, drink, or force himself on her? No one asked, because the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that she be punished. But the punishment didn't end when the wheels stopped turning. That woman would continue to be judged in village gossip, in late-night chats, in a mother's warning to her daughter. Some names are long forgotten, but the label adulterous woman lives on like kitchen smoke. The punishment became a life sentence, not behind bars, but inside the memory of the community. And that punishment, the wooden donkey, wasn't just meant to punish one person. It was meant to keep tens of thousands of other women silent. A warning made of wood and blood. This wasn't law anymore. It was a morality stage, where only women were strung up like the lead actress, in a play they never got to write. If you think the punishment of riding the wooden donkey was just a vague practice hidden in obscure legal records, then open the famous novel Water Margin, where it appears as a dramatic, striking scene, but not to condemn it, to endorse it. Madame Wang, an elderly matchmaker, didn't kill anyone. She didn't commit adultery. She didn't steal. She was simply doing her job, matchmaking. But she matched the wrong people, specifically. She arranged a union between Pan Jinlian and Xi Menqing, 2 people already tiptoeing toward an affair behind the back of Pan's husband, Wu Dalang, a man who was short, unattractive, kind, and constantly belittled. After the affair was exposed and Wu Dalang was poisoned to death, all the anger fell on Madame Wang. Not because she murdered anyone, but because she had led the way to sin. In a society where morality was used as a tool for punishment, those who didn't directly commit a crime but enabled it were often punished the harshest. And so, Madame Wang was paraded on the wooden donkey and then executed by lynching, death by 1,000 cuts. This was no longer a legal punishment. This was moral punishment, packaged inside the pages of literature. Even more strange is that the novel Water Margin, considered one of the 4 great classical novels of China, doesn't criticize the cruelty of the sentence. In fact, it almost makes the reader feel satisfied. This reflects a deeper truth. Classic Chinese serialized literature didn't just reflect reality, it trained the reader's emotions. When evil was dressed in righteousness, the reader no longer questioned, but clapped along. The mob mentality in ancient Chinese literature was often written in binaries: good versus evil, loyal versus treacherous. And once someone was labeled evil, then no matter how savage the punishment, it was seen as deserved. This wasn't just how novels were written. This was how society taught people to accept punishment without asking questions. Why? Because Madame Wang was evil, and Wu Song, the man who avenged his brother, was righteous. And in the name of righteousness, any punishment, no matter how barbaric, became justified. Literature didn't just reflect the world, it helped solidify evil when evil wore the mask of virtue. Matchmaking, one of the few trades women could survive on, became a moral trap. If a matchmaker paired the wrong couple, society didn't call it professional error, they called it moral failure. And once a woman was marked with moral guilt, there was no need for law, only public rage and a wooden donkey. When a society gets used to watching women dragged through the market, then novels no longer have room for mercy. In real life, executions were often held in the morning, when the market was most crowded. The wooden donkey wasn't just for pain, it was meant to be seen. In many records from the Ming era, such as the Great Code of Criminal Law, it's clearly stated, adulterous women shall ride the wooden donkey, be stripped of garments, and shown to the people. Humiliation became part of the sentence, a sentence not written on paper, but carved into the eyes of the people. It had only two roles, the sinful woman and the crowd applauding the execution. Not everyone gets their name in official history, but some cases still remain in texts like the supplementary records or the history of the Ming. For example, the case of Madame Peng in Shaanxi during the Ming dynasty. Accused of adultery by her husband, she was punished by public wooden donkey parade without trial or confrontation. Her real name was erased from the files. Only two characters were carved into the sentence: adulterous woman. From that moment on, she lived forever, but not by name, only by crime. A crime that required no evidence, only prejudice. If the previous chapter told of a matchmaker who was executed for pairing the wrong couple, then this chapter is about a woman who didn't love the wrong person, didn't do the wrong thing, and yet was punished for daring to speak the truth. Tang Xia, a name that sounds like a passing breeze, but once you know her story, it no longer feels light at all. During the Ming dynasty, specifically under Emperor Yongle, Zhu Di, who reigned from 1402 to 1424, China entered a grand era and an era of exhaustion. In this period, Emperor Yongle launched a series of massive construction projects, moving the capital from Nanjing to Beijing, building the Forbidden City, expanding the Grand Canal, all under the name of Heaven's mandate, yet they consumed over 1 million laborers. Numerous Ming-era records noted how ordinary people were taken for forced labor over thousands of miles, starving, collapsing from exhaustion. Hundreds of small rebellions broke out in rural areas, only to be crushed swiftly, labeled as unrest. Tang Xia was not the only case, but she was one of the rare few remembered in folk memory. And that in itself was unusual, because women were not allowed to leave a mark, especially not one that challenged the throne. He moved the capital from Nanjing to Beijing, built the Forbidden City, dug canals, opened waterways, held grand ceremonies, constructed temples, all in the name of divine will. But what he needed was very earthly: human labor. Tang Xia and her husband were commoners, living in a region conscripted for labor. They weren't bandits, not rebels, not subversive scholars. They were simply too tired of suffering. So they submitted a petition to the local officials, a gesture as small as a grain of rice, but one that fell on the altar of power. Under the Ming, especially from the year 1410 onward, when commoners submitted petitions or grievances directly to district offices, without going through village heads or local elders, it was seen as suspicious, even criminal. It could be labelled as illegal assembly or slandering the court. Many cases recorded in the Ming History Essentials note people being flogged, jailed, or even executed just for writing petitions. To the officials, Tang Xia was no longer a grieving wife. She became one who spreads the seeds of rebellion with paper and ink. A petition for justice, instead of being heard, was seen as the beginning of revolt. Tang Xia's husband was executed. She did not run. She did not wail. She led a small rebellion. And like all small rebellions, it was crushed by a very large hand. Tang Xia surrendered, hoping her surrender would save the villagers. But the feudal state never understood the word mercy. She was paraded on a wooden donkey, then dismembered. The wooden donkey wasn't a punishment for every rebel. It was used selectively, often targeting women. Unlike beheading, which was quick and less humiliating, riding the donkey was a slow death, by gazes, by insults, by exposure. It didn't just punish the body, it taught a lesson to those not yet brave enough to stand upright. She wasn't punished because she was adulterous. She was punished because she was a woman who refused to kneel. No statue was built for Tang Xia. No textbook mentioned her name. But in that land, there are old rhymes still passed down. Ethnographers studying oral literature in northern China have recorded at least 3 different versions of the nursery rhyme about Tang Xia. Some call her Aunt Tang, others the woman who stood in the market. Despite the different names, the image remains the same. A woman who didn't scream, didn't kneel, didn't shut her eyes. Punishment could not erase her from collective memory. It only made her a silent legend. A legend children still whisper, though grown-ups avoid her name. Tang Tang stood in the market, eyes open, lips sealed. The official passed and dared not glance. The children went home and told their mothers. The punishment wasn't just to kill her, but to send a message. That, if an ordinary woman dares to rise, she will be turned into a monument of warning in the town square, for 1,000 others to bow their heads as they walk by. Some deaths leave no injustice behind, but they carry the scent of blood, mixed with the sound of the crowd's laughter, and in a river of history written by kings drunk on power, there sometimes appears a woman named Tang, who was not drunk and who did not kneel. In most of the previous chapters, you've seen the wooden donkey as a punishment for women, meant to humiliate them, to warn them, to crush them under the gaze of the crowd. But there was one special case. A man was made to ride the wooden donkey, not because he was weak, not because he was guilty, but because he was chosen as a symbol of submission. Xian Buhai Han was a Mongol chieftain who lived in the late 12th century, during the time when the Jin dynasty controlled northern China. The Jin, founded by the Jurchen from 1115 to 1234, were facing the rising power of the steppe tribes, especially the Mongols and the Tatars. In the early years of the 13th century, northern China's political scene was particularly chaotic. The Jin implemented a strategy of allay and annihilate, temporarily allying with the Mongols to contain the Tatars, then planning to devour them both. Xian Buhai Han was one of the few neutral leaders, a man who tried to resolve conflict between Tatars and Mongols through diplomacy, even by marrying off his daughter. But that gentleness was betrayed by his allies. He was captured alive by the Tatars during a failed peace meeting, and instead of killing him, they handed him over to the Jin as a gift, or more precisely, as a political hostage. And the Jin chose a punishment unfit for a warrior, the wooden donkey. According to Han historical records and Mongol oral tradition, sentencing a man to the wooden donkey was extremely rare and deeply humiliating. Unlike decapitation or quartering, punishments reserved for rebels, the wooden donkey carried a feminizing tone, a public shaming, a stripping of masculine identity. It wasn't just a death, it was a gendered erasure, staged in the public square. His body, once armored, horse-mounted, waving the Mongol banner, was now tied to a wooden frame, exposed for all to see, not to kill, but to kill his honor. The image of a Mongol man, a symbol of steppe strength, bound to a block of wood in Han Chinese territory, was a symbolic blow. The Jin didn't want to execute Xian Buhai Han for a crime. They wanted to turn him into a living warning in blood. This was punishment turned political. His death was a message. This is what submission looks like. The wooden stake didn't just pierce his body. It pierced through the collective memory of the Mongols and their pride. In the Mongol oral epics, he's not always named directly, but remembered as the one bound between two springs of young grass, a reference to the time of year he died, when the steppe had not yet been reborn. That death did not echo loudly, but it lit a fire. If you cannot keep your honor, then take it back with blood. Before he died, he left only one message for his son. Do not cry. Let this vengeance forge iron into sword. That son's name was Husi, and from Husi, that blood, that vow, was passed on to another name, Genghis Khan. Stories of Xian Buhai Han's death were passed down through generations of Mongol families. Husi was not just his blood son, but also the first spiritual mentor of Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan. In one version of the legend, Husi once placed his hand on the wooden block that had killed his father and swore, "I will turn this wood into kindling for the steppe fire that will burn the south to ash." The story of Xian Buhai Han did not end with his death. In truth, that's where it began, because from the pain of one man, the Mongols created fire, and the one who lit that fire was his grandson, Temujin. Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, did not grow up under soft gazes. He grew up on memories no one was allowed to speak of, on shame buried under the grass, and on a vow carved into a saddle. No one will ever be tied up in the marketplace again, if they carry Mongol blood. Husi, Temujin's father, did not mourn with a black cloth. He mourned by forging iron, training horses, and teaching his son how to swallow shame without extinguishing fire. He didn't want Temujin to seek blind revenge. He passed on the belief that revenge wasn't about killing a man. It was about erasing what made a whole people bow their heads. It was revenge through structure, through organization, through building an empire where no one would ever have to feel humiliated again. In the legends of the steppe, Husi once took Temujin back to the place where his own father had been executed, not to cry, but to point and say, "This place, you must burn it with real fire." not just the one in your heart. And Temujin did not disappoint. From a curse of silence to a great campaign, while the Jin dynasty was sinking in political delusions and power struggles with the Southern Song, they had no idea that beyond the wind, a storm was forming. In the year 1206, after unifying the Mongol tribes, Temujin proclaimed himself Genghis Khan. But his first move wasn't to expand borders. It was to collect a debt of honor on behalf of his ancestors. We don't need revenge through pain. We take revenge through history. The campaign against the Jin began in 1211, exactly 100 years after the execution of Xian Buhai Han. In the Sis, the secret history of the Mongols, being bound is a symbol of ultimate humiliation. Riding a horse is the symbol of masculine power and absolute freedom. Temujin didn't wage war just to reclaim land, but to return the gallop of hooves to those who had once been tied up in the square. Chinese and Mongol chronicles note that the 1211 campaign began in the Hebei region, a place where many legends say Xian Buhai Han was executed by wooden donkey. The place that once raised wooden stakes for shame now became the first camp of the Mongol army, a gesture of historical defiance too symbolic to ignore. Some sources even claim Temujin deliberately chose the land where his forefather had died as the launch point of his counterattack. He didn't just defeat the Jin, he erased the political symbol that had once humiliated the Mongols. The wooden stake turned to fire and empire. In a speech before launching his attack, Genghis Khan is recorded as saying to his generals, "The one who is tied does not need pity. The one who is tied must be given a place to stand, by hooves." And from the ashes of the past, he built the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. People may forget the battle, but they do not forget the one bound between two springs of grass. And Temujin, in every hoofbeat of conquest, never forgot. Honor is not something granted by others, but history will record it if you seize it. And even as he ruled nearly all of Eurasia during ancestral rites, he always let a small wooden stake burn beside the ritual fire, not to forget, but to remember that blood does not flow on its own. It requires someone who suffered first. People often say, history is the past, but really, it's just the present in a sloppy disguise. The punishment of the wooden donkey. It sounds like some painful old legend, like it only lives in costume dramas, in yellowed pages of ancient books. But no. The idea of forcing the body in the name of morality, of tying a person to punishment as a public lesson, still lingers. During the Qing dynasty in the 18th century, records from Guangzhou and Sichuan noted a variant of the wooden donkey punishment, no longer with a sharp stake, but still humiliating. It was used especially on women who dared to sue officials, and was described as a shame punishment for women who overstepped their role. So-called justice was sometimes just a rebranding of submission labeled as virtue. It no longer took the shape of a donkey with a sharp wooden stake, but it transformed into electric chairs, leather whips, political prisons, or public live-stream denunciations. In feudal society, many women who committed adultery were not punished with a wooden donkey, but with a wooden board hanging on their chest, a chicken feather hat on their head, or being paraded through town with a sign reading "Bad Woman." Some were made to stand in the market while the crowd sang mocking folk songs. The scars from bamboo whips might heal, but the sound of ridicule follows for a lifetime. Every era has its own way of humiliating those who dare to be wrong by the standards that society calls right. Women like Tang Sire are no longer executed in public, but they are still burned by silence, by invisible laws, by words as sharp as blades in the mouths of the community. People like Xian Buhai Han are no longer tied up in the town square, but their honor is stripped by nameless verdicts, by restrictions, by the inherited fear passed down from ancestors. And it's not just ordinary people. Scholars in the Song and Ming dynasties were also tied to invisible wooden donkeys. Ideology. They weren't beheaded, but erased from examination rosters, forced to write self-confessions, made to stand in courtyards, unable to laugh, unable to cry, silenced. Some wooden donkeys require no wheels, no sharp stakes, because they live inside other people's minds, and sometimes inside our own. And in the modern era, such punishment needs no court. One comment, one expose post, one poorly timed hashtag can turn anyone into a public criminal. If history has one piece of advice, perhaps it is this: when you see someone tied up in the square, don't laugh. Because tomorrow, you might be the one standing there. At the end of this long trail of blood and wood, we never really leave the wooden donkey. We simply walk toward the place where it changes name, changes shape, and waits for the next person. There's a funny truth, or maybe just a sad one, in feudal history. People didn't just carry out justice, they staged it like a performance. In ancient China, public trials were the norm, but not to ensure transparency. They were designed to teach people how to fear. And sometimes, fear wasn't enough. The crowd had to applaud. Executions weren't just punishments, they were shows. And the accused was the lead actor who never got paid. According to Confucian thought, public sentencing was a way to teach people propriety, justice, honesty, shame. But in practice, it created a moment where the entire village could become judge, audience, and sometimes even director. Justice turned into a chorus of insults, where everyone got to join the song. From the Tang to the Ming dynasties, public executions were usually held at high noon, when the sun was brightest and crowds easiest to gather. The local magistrate read out the crimes in a stern voice, like a professional MC. Then the accused was dragged out to cheers and jeers, no different from a variety show. The wooden donkey, in that context, wasn't just a tool of punishment, but a stage prop. The person tied to it didn't just suffer, they became a form of public entertainment. The pain from the stake lasted hours, but the villagers' laughter lasted a lifetime. There are records from the Song dynasty of children being lifted onto adults' shoulders to get a better view, as the prisoner was paraded on the donkey. In Water Margin, a novel that reflects many details of feudal society, the character Madame Wang is punished not just with the wooden donkey, but paraded through the market so the crowd could freely hurl insults. That wasn't fiction. That was a recurring act in real life, where the loudest screams didn't come from pain, but from the thrill of the audience. Mothers whispered to daughters, "Look closely, so you'll never be bad." Old men brought steamed buns, eating while commenting on the crimes like it was opera. And the crowd got to release their stress, using someone else's blood. When fear gets mixed with entertainment, justice stops being truth and becomes a script. At that point, law isn't there to protect order. It becomes a machine that digests social frustration by sacrificing a scapegoat. And that goat, more often than not, wasn't chosen because of guilt, but because they happened to be in the right place, at the right time, and stayed just silent enough. Today, that stage has only moved from the public square to the screen. Live-stream denunciations, expose videos, online witch hunts. They are the new version of the old feudal court. And every share, every mocking comment is the modern echo of that ancient crowd's drumbeat. The punishment no longer comes from sticks, but from algorithms. That's not justice. That's a game with props, an audience, and a player who never gets to leave the stage. Imagine this. You're not the one riding the donkey. You're the one standing in the courtyard, holding your child's hand and pointing at the sharp stake. You didn't spill any blood, but your laughter was part of the sentence. In every civilization, from the Qin dynasty to modern times, public punishment has always required two things: someone to suffer and someone to watch. When Genghis Khan marched for revenge, he didn't just restore his father's honor. He also pulled his people's hands off the turning wheel, the wheel that had crushed both flesh and faith for generations. When Tang's sire mounted the wooden donkey, she wasn't filled with fear, but compassion, because she knew her pain might save a few other lives. When Madame Wang was paraded through the marketplace, there were no more tears in her eyes, because the tears had dried the moment the villagers laughed for the first time. And when you, a person living in the 21st century, share a viral post condemning someone without investigation, comment a sarcastic line about someone you've never met, are you turning another wheel? Not made of wood, but still cutting deep into flesh. History isn't dead. It just changes clothes and plays again. 10. Historic firsts achieved by women. There's something textbooks often leave out. Chemistry, the field full of smoke, bubbling liquids, and suspicious bottles, didn't begin with a bespectacled man in a lab coat. It began with a woman. A woman who lived in the royal palace of Babylon over 3,000 years ago. This was during the Kassite Empire, where palaces were paved with white limestone, floors were sprinkled with scented ash, and wide hallways led to hanging gardens. The Babylonian palace wasn't just the king's residence. It was an administrative, religious, and ceremonial hub where scent wasn't merely cosmetic, but a symbol of class and divine favor. Her name was Taputi. No one knows what she looked like. No bust, no portrait. Only a few lines carved into clay tablets, a medium that, ironically, has lasted longer than most nameplates on modern lab doors. According to those inscriptions, Taputi was a royal perfumer. It sounds simple, until you realize she had no test tubes, no ethanol, no pressure chamber, no magnetic stirrer. What she had were flowers, tree resin, cypress root oil, myrrh, and a peculiar kind of stubbornness. Taputi didn't mix fragrances like a DIY TikTok video. She used a crude but astonishing distillation technique, boiling fragrant compounds in a clay vessel, channeling steam through reed or ceramic cooling pipes, and collecting the condensed essence. This was a primitive form of distillation, predating Egyptian stills or Greek alchemy by centuries. Some scholars believe her cuneiform inscribed formula is the earliest known record of a distillation apparatus, the precursor to all modern chemistry labs. She distilled, meaning she boiled, captured vapor, cooled it down, filtered, and refined to create pure scent. And she left a formula. Not a whispered family secret, but an actual document, etched in cuneiform on clay tablets, considered the first scientific handbook ever discovered. Interestingly, no man from her era managed to do the same. Specific, precise. A fragment describing a fragrance-making process is believed to be the earliest written record of a distillation device in human history. She, a woman of the Bronze Age, stepped into the realm of science, of principles, and of transformative art. How? Simply through scent. In Taputi's world, perfume wasn't just luxury, it was ritual, it was soft power. It was how the Babylonian court declared its purity and glory to the gods. Each fragrance was a prayer, a political statement, made through the nose. It was a symbol of power, of refinement, and at times, a diplomatic weapon. And Taputi, somehow, was more than a scent mixer. She was a chemist, an engineer, a pioneer who ventured into the molecular realm, while the world was still choosing between clay and bronze. Think of that. Next time you spray a little perfume on your wrist, and when you see a 6 million dong price tag on a bottle of essential oil, remember, Taputi did it 3,000 years ago, without TikTok, without a lab, and definitely without an influencer to review it for her. It may have all begun with a woman's hand stirring fragrant oil beneath the desert sun. If you've ever sat in a lecture hall complaining about a 300-slide PowerPoint, take a moment to thank Fatima Al-Firi. Because if it weren't for her, you might have been learning under a tree. Fatima was born around 800 Common Era in the city of Kairouan, what is now Tunisia. She grew up in a prosperous Muslim family, steeped in the values of knowledge and faith. When her father passed away, Fatima and her sister migrated to Fez, the cultural capital of the Idrisid kingdom, a city gilded with merchants, scholars, and the rich scent of cinnamon in the air. By the 9th century, Fez had become a vibrant hub of intellect and commerce, where poets from Andalusia crossed paths with scholars from Baghdad, where the sound of religious teaching mingled with papyrus vendors' chants. While Europe was still fumbling with Flintstones and feudalism, Fez was already a Silicon Valley with the scent of incense, with books, ink, and ideas on sale at the market. And then, she did something few women dare to even imagine. Even in today's world, she founded a university, not a tutoring class, not a test prep center, a full-fledged university with a library, lecture halls, and a continuous curriculum, over 1,000 years before Oxford or the Sorbonne ever opened their doors. On the first day of Ramadan in the year 859, Fatima began constructing Al-Qarawiyyin, a complex that included a mosque, a library, and an educational center. At Al-Qarawiyyin, education and faith weren't separate systems. Math was studied to understand the order of the universe. Astronomy was used to calculate Ramadan. Logic was sharpened to debate schools of thought, all in pursuit of deeper understanding of one's place in a world crafted by Allah. She fasted throughout the construction as a sign of devotion, and didn't step inside the building until it was fully completed. In an age where the wealthy often starved to lose weight, Fatima chose hunger to build a structure for centuries of learning. Each drop of sweat was a silent prayer, and each stomach growl, perhaps a reminder. Knowledge isn't born from comfort, but from uncompromising commitment. when the building was done, she didn't throw a grand opening ceremony. She simply stepped in and began to pray. From that moment on, Al-Qarawiyyin became one of the most important academic centers of the Islamic world, where scholars taught mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, and law. Of course, there were no color-printed diplomas or mortarboard tosses back then, but something far more important happened. Knowledge was passed on. She didn't preach. She didn't need a podium. She just left behind a structure where knowledge could live, grow, and spill beyond the gates of Fez. Ironically, while much of Europe was still digging through scripture to determine whether women even had souls, a Muslim woman was quietly redefining the future of global education. In a world where women were barred from public academic life, from ancient Athens to Rome, from Canterbury to Cordoba, Fatima's decision wasn't just personal, it was a reversal of historical roles. Like Hypatia of Alexandria, Fatima was a scholar surrounded by orthodoxy, but instead of leaving behind a tragic death, she left behind a living structure. Today, the University of Al-Qarawiyyin still operates, recognized as one of the oldest continually running universities in the world. Its library, restored in 2016 by architect Aziza Chowni, still holds thousands of ancient manuscripts, including masterpieces like Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun and the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna. And if you think a modern library with air conditioning and Wi-Fi is peak experience, well, Al-Qarawiyyin already had hand-carved reading desks, ink stored in fig shells, and sunlight filtered through mashrabiyah windows from the 9th century. Fatima passed away around 880 Common Era. No statue was built in her honor. No Shakespearean play bore her name. Only a living entity continues her work, hour by hour, day by day, through the sound of turning pages and the eyes of students seeing something for the very first time. You don't have to be royalty or a warrior to enter history. You just have to leave behind a place where wisdom can take root. And in doing so, Fatima became the architect of global academia. A woman who didn't take a seat in class. She built the class. If there were an award for being so bored of court life, you had to write a novel to survive. Murasaki Shikibu would have taken the first prize. Born in 973, into a mid-ranking noble family during Japan's Heian period, Murasaki grew up in a world where women weren't encouraged to read. It was an era when the Japanese imperial court resembled a washi paper stage, where every movement, sound, even a glance, had to be orchestrated with elegance. In that space, the most prominent sound wasn't voices, but the soft glide of shoji doors, the steady clack of gaiter sandals down wooden corridors, and sometimes the quiet sighs of court ladies, confined so deeply in silk, they had no room left to feel sad. In that world, women weren't judged by degrees, but by the length of their sleeves and the scent of their sandalwood perfume. A society where poetry was currency, and emotion, if it hoped to survive, had to disguise itself as delicate prose, especially Chinese characters, the official script reserved for men, scholars, and government elites. But instead of learning embroidery or how to smile properly in court, Murasaki eavesdropped on her brother's lessons, then quietly devoured every classic text she could find. At an age when most girls were being married off to manage the palace like emotional software, Murasaki was turning herself into a literary operating system. When her husband, a much older court official, died just 2 years after they married. Murasaki became a widow in her 20s, raising her child in silence and writing. She was invited to serve Empress Shoshi, a reserved but brilliant woman who created a space for Murasaki to keep writing. And from those long nights, behind sliding paper walls and the echo of wooden clogs in empty hallways, a literary epic was born. The Tale of Genji, widely considered the first novel in human history, a manuscript of over 1,000 handwritten pages, featuring Prince Genji, charming, melancholic, innocent, cunning, navigating court life through dozens of love affairs and deep inner turmoil. This wasn't just a novel, it was psychoanalysis written in flower ink and rice paper, nearly a millennium before Sigmund Freud. The main character, Prince Genji, handsome, gifted, living within the palace yet always feeling alone. Across more than 1,000 pages, Murasaki didn't just talk about romance. She meticulously captured the psychology, rituals, sorrow, and sheer boredom of the Japanese nobility. While historians recorded wars and triumphs, Murasaki recorded feelings, the most fleeting, yet the most real. And she wrote in Japanese, a humble, overlooked language in the male-dominated academic world. Ironically, being excluded from Chinese, the privileged scholarly script allowed women like Murasaki and Sei Shonagon, author of The Pillow Book, to create the world's first women's literature. Here, court ladies were no longer mere backgrounds for male poetry, but sharp commentators of court life, sometimes throwing shade more elegantly than any haiku. It was a language the women could read, in an age when literature was considered a pastime reserved for men. Handwritten copies of the Tale of Genji were quickly passed between court women, then beyond palace walls, and have survived for centuries. Murasaki died around 1014, leaving behind little personal correspondence or biography, only diary entries full of metaphor, loneliness, the dullness of palace life, and the feeling of being simultaneously cherished and controlled. In her writings, you find a woman who didn't write to be famous. She wrote to stay sane, to not turn to stone in a palace where no one truly saw how she felt. And that made her even more legendary. When someone asks, who was the first female novelist in history? Her name is the first to be mentioned. No explanation needed. Because sometimes, writing isn't just storytelling. It's survival. It's the act of being seen. It's creating a world where emotions are allowed to exist, even when silenced by silk and ceremony. And Murasaki, alone in a maze of rules, did just that. Today, her name isn't just in textbooks. It orbits Earth as a small planet, Murasaki 5123, as if the universe itself acknowledges that a woman once confined in a palace built an entire world, with just a brush and the refusal to disappear. If anyone ever created a monster, just to mirror her own pain, it was Mary Shelley. Born in 1797 in London, Mary wasn't just the daughter of two intellectual giants, William Godwin, a radical philosopher, and Mary Wollstonecraft, author of Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Her mother died just 10 days after giving birth, leaving the little girl to grow up surrounded by libraries, revolutionary ideals, and the impossible emptiness of a mother she never knew. It's no coincidence that in Frankenstein, the nameless, rejected creature yearns for one thing: to be seen as a child in need of love. Many critics have read Mary's novel not as a tale of horror, but as the ache of an orphan longing to hold her mother, but finding her only in memory. Mary grew up in a house full of words, but without warmth. Her father remarried a cold and distant woman, and Mary soon felt like a ghost in her own home. At just 16, Mary fell for the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, a dazzlingly romantic, wildly complicated man who was already married to a pregnant wife. Their love story didn't begin in a park or tea house, but on her mother's grave. Percy left his wife, ran off with Mary and her stepsister Claire Clairmont, wandering across Europe with no money, no honor, only poetry, philosophy, and scandal. In 1816, during a cold and dreary vacation at Lord Byron's villa by Lake Geneva, the group decided to write ghost stories. While the gentlemen read tales of vampires and spirits, Mary, just 19, woke from a nightmare with an idea. A young doctor reanimates a corpse, then abandons his creation. Frankenstein was born. But make no mistake, this wasn't a simple horror story. It was a brutal, ironic metaphor for a world built by men, a creature born without a mother, rejected by the very man who gave him life. Mary posed a bold question. What happens when men try to do the most sacred thing, create life, without women? The result, a lonely soul, never taught love, unaccepted, who becomes a monster not by nature, but because he was denied care before he even learned to speak. It was a story not just of science and morality, but of abandonment, of mothers who lost children, of children who lost fathers, of lives pushed to the margins of the world. In 1818, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was published anonymously, and everyone assumed Percy had written it. But it was Mary who had created the first true work of science fiction. A man uses technology to replace God, and fails, tragically. The book didn't make them rich. They still ran from debts, lived in exile, and suffered endlessly. Mary lost 3 children to illness, at one point writing in her journal, "I gave birth to death." Meanwhile, Percy kept cheating, even with Claire. She buried their child. He went for a walk with another woman, perhaps searching for a poem, or simply someone to erase the last death. They lived like colliding planets, burning, then leaving ashes. But Mary kept writing, kept existing, in the absolute isolation of a woman who was both brilliant and deeply wounded. In 1822, Percy drowned in a storm off the coast of Italy. When his body was cremated, his heart didn't burn, damaged by pneumonia years earlier, and Mary kept it in a jar of wine for the rest of her life. After Percy's death, Mary returned to England, raising their son quietly and secretly continuing to write. Her father-in-law only supported her financially on the condition that she publish nothing. She obeyed, publicly. But in the shadows, Mary kept writing, editing, preserving their literary legacy. Mary Shelley died of a brain tumor in 1851, at just 53. Before that, she lived like a ghost in her own home, paid to remain silent, forbidden to publish, yet still writing, as if language were the only way she could breathe. She carefully edited Percy's drafts, copied his diaries, guarded their ideas, not for fame, but out of a love that refused to die. Her idea that science could create life, but not love, has lived on in every work of science fiction since. No one called Mary a science fiction writer back then, because the genre didn't exist. She invented it during a cold summer with a broken heart and an imagination no one could stop. From Frankenstein to the robots of Isaac Asimov to the artificial intelligence of the 21st century, they all carry the echo of a creature unloved, and their origin was a 19-year-old girl writing by candlelight in the wind and rain, just trying not to lose her mind to grief. United Kingdom, 1843. If you've ever stared at a Windows loading screen and wondered why your life is stuck buffering, then thank Ada Lovelace. Born in 1815, she was the only child from the unhappy marriage of Lord Byron, the famous poet, charismatic and morally chaotic, and Lady Annabella Milbank, a noblewoman obsessed with mathematics and deeply allergic to her husband's whimsy. 10 weeks after Ada was born, her mother left Lord Byron. Ada would never see her father again. He died in Greece when she was 8, leaving her a legendary surname and a heart that didn't quite belong anywhere. Raised under her mother's control like an ethical experiment, Ada was taught math, science, logic, and to stay far away from poetry. Lady Annabella didn't call her sweetheart or my little angel, but gave her the chilly nickname, the analyst. It wasn't a compliment. It was a debugging project. To her, poetry was a virus, and equations were the cure. Ada grew up like a baby computer, programmed to forget her father, the world-famous poet, as if he never existed. Ironically, the mother who wanted her to kill the poetry so she wouldn't become another Byron, raised a daughter who somehow merged it all, as if mathematics had rhythm and code could mourn. Ada called her pursuit poetical science, a way to express emotion through rules, like writing music with algebra. To Ada, programming wasn't just a skill, it was language, music, and intuition. She didn't dream of fast computers. She dreamed of computers that could sing. At 17, Ada met mathematician Charles Babbage, father of the first computer, the analytical engine. While aristocrats saw a mess of gears, Ada saw an orchestra. She immediately grasped the machine's potential, not just for calculations, but to simulate anything expressible in numbers, from music to mathematical expressions. In 1843, at just 28 years old, Ada translated an Italian article about the analytical engine. But more importantly, she added footnotes 3 times longer than the original text, in which she described how to program the machine, use punch cards to control tasks, and even envisioned the concept of looping, character encoding, and a command system that could call itself, concepts that later became core to computer programming. In one note, she included a detailed example of how the machine could calculate Bernoulli numbers, a mathematical marvel at the time. What shocked people wasn't just the formula, but Ada's vision that the machine could do anything if expressed logically. Yes, that was the first computer program, and it was written by a woman. Of course, the article had to be published under the initials A.L., because in those days, if you were female and intelligent, you were supposed to keep it a secret. Babbage called her the enchantress of numbers, but society looked at her with suspicion. Ada programmed while mothering 3 children, struggling with declining health due to tuberculosis complications, and, somewhat adorably, gambling on horse races. She once believed she could use math to predict horse race outcomes, a beautifully doomed idea. In her later years, she lived in opium-induced hallucinations, gradually swallowed by the shadows of her own mind. Doctors prescribed her a cocktail of opiates and alcohol. Ada died in 1852, at the age of 36, the same age as her father, the man she longed to understand, if only through blood. Before her death, Ada requested to be buried next to her father, the man she never met, a poet and a programmer, two souls misunderstood by their times, now lying side by side in a damp graveyard in Hucknall, England. It took more than a century for Ada's lines of code to be recognized as the foundation of modern programming. In 1980, the U.S. Department of Defense developed a new programming language and named it Ada in her honor. Every year, on the second Tuesday of October, the world celebrates Ada Lovelace Day to honor women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In a world where billions live on a few lines of code, one woman who dreamed of computers that could sing laid the first brick. Under the glow of programming, Ada wasn't just the first. She was the one who saw the future, in gears. If you've ever been stuck in traffic on the highway because GPS rerouted you 3 times, think of Bertha Benz. She was the first woman to complete a long-distance drive in history, at a time when gas-powered cars were still seen as men's artistic toys. Born in 1849 in Germany, Bertha came from a wealthy family, well-educated, passionate about science and engineering. In 1871, she married Carl Benz, a poor but ambitious engineer who would later develop the world's first car powered by an internal combustion engine. But Carl, frankly, was insecure. Even though he invented the Benz patent motor wagon and filed for the patent in 1886, Carl was reluctant to promote it and afraid of failure. Though he had invented the car, Carl lacked the courage to believe in his own invention. He feared public opinion, feared risk, and feared even letting his wife go too far. As for Bertha, her only fear was that history might forget her name. Miss Bertha did not. One summer morning in 1888, she left a note for her husband, took their 2 young sons, and drove from Mannheim to her mother's house in Pforzheim. A journey of 106 kilometers. History calls it rebellion. Engineering calls it marketing. Along the way, Bertha repaired the car when the engine clogged. She used her hatpin to clear the fuel line, used her garter to fix the brake, and bought gasoline at a pharmacy, since fuel was only sold as cleaning solvent at the time. The pharmacy in Wiesloch, where Bertha bought the fuel, is now recognized as the world's first gas station. No signpost, no pump, just a jar of Ligroin and a woman asking, "Is this enough to keep me going?" Every time the car couldn't climb a hill, her sons got out to push. At one point, they had to stop to fix the electrical wiring, pull over in strong wind, and sleep at a local inn, only to hit the road again the next day. Both Bertha's mother and the townspeople gathered to see the horseless carriage, and Carl Benz received a telegram. His wife and children were safe. They had arrived, and now everyone knew about the car. The Benz automobile was soon showcased at the Paris Expo in 1889. History changed course. Bertha Benz would live until 1944, reaching the age of 95. While Carl Benz may have invented the car, it was Bertha who drove it into history. Today, The route she once drove is known as the Bertha Benz Memorial Route, a reminder that cars are built to run. But it was a woman who first took the wheel and set history in motion. If you've ever had a chest X-ray or learned about radiation through sci-fi movies, then thank Marie Curie, the woman who discovered it and was killed by it. Born in 1867 in Warsaw, Poland, to a poor family of educators, Marie was an outstanding student, intelligent, quiet, but full of determination. She was so good at school, she was banned from studying. At the time, Poland was under Russian Empire control, and women weren't allowed to attend university. Marie didn't give up. She studied secretly in the underground flying university, then worked as a governess to save money and send her sister abroad to study first. After a few years, the sisters switched roles. Marie went to Paris to study at the Sorbonne and spent her college years cold and hungry. In a tiny, unheated room, she survived on dry bread and atomic dreams. In 1894, Marie met Pierre Curie, a physicist who disliked socializing and didn't trust women. But after a few discussions, Pierre realized Marie wasn't just good. She surpassed every man he had ever met. They married and became a scientific couple with a rather messy lifestyle. They didn't go on a honeymoon. Instead, they biked off to study minerals. Marie had 2 children, teaching, mothering, and researching all at once. In 1898, they discovered 2 new elements: polonium, named after her homeland, Poland, and radium, a radioactive substance so powerful it could burn skin with just a few minutes of contact. Marie didn't keep the formula secret. She published it so all humanity could benefit. And soon, the price became clear: darkened nails, tingling skin, wounds that wouldn't heal. That brilliant light turned out to be a silent killer. In 1903, Marie, along with her husband and Henri Becquerel, received the Nobel Prize in Physics. She was the first woman in history to win a Nobel. But when she was nominated for the French Academy of Sciences, she was rejected simply because she was a woman. The media at the time vilified her, not for her science, but because she dared to exist outside gender norms. Marie became a symbol not because of recognition, but because she survived every rejection. Not long after, Pierre was run over by a horse-drawn carriage in the streets of Paris. His head was crushed by a wheel. People expected Marie to collapse, but at the funeral, she quietly took her husband's position at the Sorbonne, becoming the first female professor in French history. Marie continued her research alone. In 1911, she earned her second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for isolating pure radium. She was the first person in history, male or female, to win 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different fields. But she was not loved. The French press mocked Widow Curie, fabricating rumors of affairs. They forgot she was inventing the first mobile X-ray machines, driving into World War I battlefields to treat soldiers. She deployed over 200 mobile X-ray units, trained hundreds of nurses and doctors herself, and drove a machine that could pierce through flesh, blood, and prejudice. They called her the woman who brought light, not because of science, but because she dared to illuminate hell. No medals, no white coat, just a wool sweater, tired eyes, and a finger still blistered from radiation burns. Marie died in 1934 from aplastic anemia, caused by prolonged radium exposure. Throughout her life, she quietly taught her daughter Irene how to measure radiation, record experiments, and analyze data like a true scientist. Irene didn't just inherit the scientific gene, she was a real companion, building mobile X-ray units with her mother during the war, and later, winning the Nobel Prize in 1935 with her husband, Frédéric Joliot-Curie. When Marie lit up the world, she also lit up her own child. Even today, her notebooks and lab coat remain radioactive and must be stored in lead-lined boxes. But her blood was not spilled in vain. Her daughter, Irène Joliot-Curie, continued the research and also won the Nobel Prize. Their entire family, husband, wife, daughter, and son-in-law, became a Nobel dynasty, enshrined in the Pantheon, final resting place of France's greats. Perhaps only Marie knew. Light is not always warm. Sometimes it burns. Before Elvis shook his hips, before Chuck Berry sprinted across his guitar like he was struck by lightning, there was a black woman with an electric guitar, high heels, and a voice that could blow the roof off a church. Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Born in 1915 in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, where the cotton was white but civil rights were dark. Rosetta grew up in the sound of gospel and the scent of sweat on the fields. Her mother was a gospel singer and traveling evangelist. The two wandered across the American South. No car, no money, only their voices, their faith, and a wooden guitar. By age 6, Rosetta was performing at revival meetings. While the congregation nodded off in prayer, the little girl plucked a string, and the whole church woke up. People called her a miracle child, but that miracle didn't stay in the church forever. In 1938, at the age of 23, Rosetta signed a recording contract with Decca Records, becoming the first black woman to play electric guitar on a commercial record. The song Rock Me rang out across cities, not like a hymn, but like a thunderclap in a drought-stricken musical landscape. Rosetta played guitar like someone struck by electricity and sang like she was preaching the apocalypse, but with a smile and bold red lipstick. Church folks called her a traitor. The public called her too masculine, but the crowds called her a voice that could not be denied. In the 1940s, Rosetta toured across the United States, performing at the Cotton Club, Carnegie Hall, and tiny roadside churches. She became the first artist to blend gospel with boogie-woogie rhythm, laying the foundation of rock and roll. And then the men came to copy. Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, all admitted, without Rosetta, there would be no them. But history, which preferred white men, forgot that fact for nearly 50 years. Rosetta didn't care. In 1951, she held her wedding in a stadium, sold tickets to 20,000 fans, hired a band, filmed the event, and performed a full-blown live concert. She turned her wedding day into a rock show. They said she played guitar like a man, but really, it was men who were trying to imitate Rosetta. Toward the end of her life, Rosetta battled diabetes, suffered a stroke, and lost a leg. But before that, in 1964, she toured the United Kingdom with Muddy Waters and unexpectedly became a living inspiration to a generation of young European rock musicians. At one performance on a Manchester train platform, in the rain, between whistles and steel, Rosetta wore a dress, held her white Gibson SG, and played guitar with fire and soul. That day, In the crowd stood Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Keith Richards, and the future of rock. She died in 1973 in a small apartment in Philadelphia. No major newspapers mentioned her. No state funeral, no grand legacy. Only the sound of guitar echoing on stage and the shadow of a woman in a dress, holding a guitar, singing like, "There's nothing left to lose tomorrow." Because rock wasn't born in a studio. It was born out of a hunger for freedom. And Rosetta was the first to scream that hunger through her strings. If anyone ever turned the role of First Lady from a job of waving hands and arranging flowers into a full-time profession of political and social activism, it was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was born in 1884 in New York into a very Roosevelt aristocratic family, but not a very warm one. Eleanor's mother thought her daughter was ugly. Her father was an alcoholic with a golden heart and a rotting liver. By the time she was 10, both parents had passed away, leaving Eleanor and her younger brother adrift among relatives as cold as the December weather in Boston. And that's when Eleanor began to develop a skill many future feminist activists would understand all too well: the skill of handling everything in silence. At 17, she met a tall man with a shy smile from another branch of the Roosevelt family. His name was Franklin. The relatives said they shouldn't fall in love. The more they said that, the more the two married. Eleanor gave birth to 6 children and discovered that her husband was having an affair with his personal secretary. During the years in the White House, Eleanor wrote hundreds of love letters to journalist Lorena Hickok, a relationship never publicly defined, but impossible to hide in her words. "Every night without you, my heart feels cold as stone." In a society still tightly shut, Eleanor lived 2 parallel lives. On one side, the wife standing behind a president, and on the other, a woman who knew exactly who she loved, though she was never allowed to say it out loud. And so, she learned a new skill: patience with the system, to slowly change it from within. When Franklin Roosevelt was paralyzed in 1921, Eleanor didn't walk away. She helped him rise again in politics. But while he stood in front of the cameras with a strong posture, Eleanor traveled across the country, visiting labor camps, speaking with workers, women, and people of color, those who were never invited into the White House until she invited them. From 1933 to 1945, as First Lady of the United States, she wrote a daily column, spoke weekly on the radio, and held press conferences only for female reporters, because newsrooms were almost entirely male. But she didn't stop at words. Eleanor publicly opposed her husband's order to detain tens of thousands of Japanese Americans in internment camps after Pearl Harbor in 1941. She wrote letters, met with officials, and even visited the camps where children, United States citizens, were locked behind barbed wire just for having Japanese surnames. "We cannot preach freedom if we begin with fear and prejudice," she said. They called her a troublesome lady. Eleanor smiled and replied, "You may call me troublesome, as long as I'm right." When Franklin died in 1945, she was 61, no longer First Lady. She could have rested, written memoirs, admired flowers. But then, someone knocked. The United Nations was being founded, and they needed someone to serve as the first chair of the Human Rights Commission. A woman, a recent widow, someone the elites had always mocked, and Eleanor said yes. She sat at the round table in Geneva, among a crowd of men in suits, speaking in the polished dialects of diplomacy. Many smirked at the idea of Eleanor as chair. They thought she was just a former wife of a dead president. But then, Eleanor opened the first session by listing dozens of cases of men, women, and children being tortured, starved, and oppressed around the world. Within the first 5 minutes, she didn't need power, only truth. Eleanor cut through the diplomatic games and presented the draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document unlike anything in human history, a declaration not made for the television, but for every human being suffocating under war, poverty, discrimination, or simply being forgotten. In that draft, she wrote, "Human rights begin in small places, close to home, in streets, schools, factories, offices." There was no reason left to object. The declaration was adopted in 1948, and Eleanor was called the First Lady of the World. She didn't found a nation. She didn't invent a weapon. She only had a pen, a quiet heart, and a will that refused to look away from the suffering of others. Eleanor died in 1962, at the age of 78. She has no grand monument, but every time you walk into a store and see the sign "No discrimination based on gender, race, or religion," Eleanor is there, because human rights aren't something handed down. They're something claimed, line by line, word by word, by a woman once called ugly and too concerned with other people's business. What were you doing at 14? Maybe hiding a terrible math test under your pillow. Maybe daydreaming that Justin Bieber would reply to your comment. But for one girl in the Carpathian Mountains, 14 was the age she leapt onto the uneven bars and rewrote history with her tiny feet and a fearless spine. Her name was Nadia Comaneci. And no, this is not a fairy tale. In 1976, at the Montreal Olympics, when the whole world still thought perfection is just theoretical, Nadia flew across the bars like a willow branch programmed by quantum physics. She landed as softly as a bird, then looked up at the scoreboard. 1.00. 1 point, not wrong. The electronic board didn't have space to show 10.00, because who would be insane enough to program a scoring machine for perfection? The audience was confused. The judges nodded, and for the first time in Olympic history, a human being, a teenage girl, received a perfect 10, not once, 7 times, 4 on the uneven bars, 3 on the balance beam, and each time, the world held its breath as if watching an angel test gravity. But behind the white leotard, the gentle smile, and the braided hair was an entire political system, where sports were tools of propaganda, where a child's success meant glory for a regime, and where every flip was a gamble with loyalty. Coach Bela Karolyi, a master so skilled he got exiled for criticizing Soviet judges, defected to the United States. And in 1989, as Romania began to shatter like a thrown mirror, Nadia fled too, in the night, through forests, across the Hungarian border, no luggage, just one thing no one could confiscate, the title of the most perfect girl in Olympic history. She arrived in Oklahoma, starting from scratch, no podium, no scoreboards, no flashing cameras, just a small gym where she taught American kids how to flip without breaking their backs. Then one day, she reconnected with Bart Connor, an American gymnast who had competed alongside Nadia in the old Olympics. They got married. In Romania, The national television broadcast their wedding like it was airing the reconciliation of East and West. No one asked Nadia if she ever felt lonely under those bright lights. No one knew how many times that perfect 10 felt like a sweet shackle rather than a reward. But when you see a little girl on TV, flipping mid-air, remember, the first person who made the world redefine perfection was a 14-year-old girl from a country whose name the world still spelled wrong on the map. Royals, nobles and mistresses with syphilis. Duke of Urbino died young of syphilis, leaving behind Catherine de' Medici. Her mother died after childbirth. Her father died a week later. A generation abandoned in convents. Florence in turmoil. Imagine being born between two funerals. No welcoming arms, no royal feast, only church bells and the scent of embalming oils. That was the birth of Catherine de' Medici, one of the most powerful queens of France, but also an orphan before she ever opened her eyes. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, was once the political hope of the famous Medici family. Born into glory, he grew up among the chessboards of power and the ink-stained scent of Florence's banknotes. But instead of becoming a historical figure in textbooks, Lorenzo became a small name in a medical report. In 1516, backed by his uncle, Pope Leo X, Lorenzo led the reconquest of Urbino. He won. And like many victorious men of the Renaissance, he celebrated by sleeping with someone he probably shouldn't have. Maybe a prostitute, maybe a noblewoman on her way to church. We don't know. What we do know is he contracted syphilis, and no noble title could protect him from a disease that started as a small sore and ended in a mouldy death. He married Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French noblewoman described as poetic in beauty and fragile as stationery. Their 1518 wedding was a lavish event, where lace veils and Italian wine played background to a marriage that never had time to bloom. No one at the time knew that behind the bride's veil, a spiral-shaped bacterium was lying in wait. Lorenzo was still in the early stages of syphilis. The sore may have dried, but the bacteria never slept. On their wedding night, instead of sharing a future, they likely shared a disease. And if Madeleine carried any poetry within her, it was written in mercury. At the time, Renaissance medicine had only one weapon against syphilis: mercury. They applied it, inhaled it, drank it, and sometimes died from the cure faster than from the disease. But in the Medici court, where honor mattered more than symptoms, no one was allowed to have a fever. They were only allowed to turn pale with noble grace. They had one daughter, Catherine. Madeleine died 2 weeks after childbirth. Lorenzo died a week after his wife. Catherine was 3 weeks old. No father, no mother, no throne. And if you need an image to remember her childhood, picture a cold stone room where the only light came from a flickering candle and the sigh of a nun over 50 years old. No father, no mother, no throne. Just a cold cradle in a convent where nuns cared for her like a political echo no one knew how to use. Florence at the time was a mess, like a map soaked in spilled coffee. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the city was the center of Renaissance art, but also a stage for bloody political schemes. The Medici family rose and fell like stocks, exiled from Florence in 1494, only to return thanks to the power of banking and Pope Leo X, Lorenzo's uncle. After reclaiming Urbino in 1516, Lorenzo, with papal backing, was seen as the key to restoring Medici control. But Florence was still restless. The Florentine Republic, rival families like the Pazzi and Soderini, militia groups, all eyed the seat of power. While Medici members held wine-fueled feasts in the palazzo, the streets outside flew banners demanding new leadership. And amid this storm, Catherine grew up without parents. No one told her the colour of her mother's hair or the sound of her father's voice. All she had were a few portraits and rumours that she was born into a rich lineage, but one in debt to history, paid in blood and spiral-shaped bacteria. Just a few nuns, some scripture, and the evening bell, as sombre as a ringtone from fate. Power struggles raged. The Medici were expelled, then returned, then expelled again. Amid the chaos, Catherine remained in the convent, thin, quiet, and taught that marriage is a weapon of war. Later, when she was married off to Henry II of France, she entered the palace with no parents, no memories, only a Medici name and a legacy soaked in syphilis. Lorenzo de' Medici is not remembered as a brilliant leader or cultural icon. He's remembered, if at all, as a father who died too soon to see his daughter become queen, and too late to save his family from slipping into tragedy. And syphilis, as usual, stood behind the curtain, clapping silently. Widowed at 27, healed herself. Mother of Cosimo I, founder of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Her skull, traces of late-stage syphilis. If you've ever heard that the Renaissance was an age of discovery and light, let Maria Salviati tell you about the shadows, where women, illness, and science collided without leaving a sound. Born in 1499, Maria Salviati was a Medici by blood and a Sforza by marriage. She married Giovanni delle Bande Nere, a famous mercenary lord, brave, and equally known for his hot temper and early death. They had a short marriage, but long enough to give birth to a boy, who would later become Cosimo I, the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. But when Giovanni died in battle, his leg wounded, infected, amputated, and eventually lost to gangrene, Maria was just 27, a young widow, in an era when widows had few choices besides the convent, or simply vanishing from political life. But Maria didn't vanish. She stayed in Florence, in the shadows, raising her son and quietly doing what very few women dared to do at the time, studying medicine. From 1520 to 1540, Florence was both radiant and crumbling. Beneath the makeup of the Renaissance were non-stop political fractures. The Medici had returned from exile, but their rule was still shaky. In the cold stone palaces, alliances, betrayals, and marriage deals bloomed like mold on velvet. Amid it all, Maria was like a rare herb, not thriving in the bright sun of glory, but growing silently in the damp corners where men never tread. The medicine room, the place of women and illness. She didn't publish, didn't debate, didn't get her name engraved, but in her journals and her apothecary, Maria recorded formulas and preparations. Her medicine room lay deep within a villa on the outskirts of Florence, where weak light seeped through yellowed lace curtains, and the scent of dried mint mingled with mercury vapor. On the table were jars labeled in trembling Latin, beside a set of surgical knives she never showed to anyone. Maria didn't just heal. She decoded pain with the quiet of her hands, experimenting with herbs and, according to rumors, treating her own painful sores of unknown origin, possibly syphilis. Syphilis spared no one, not even the nobility, and it showed no mercy to women who were forced into silence. Maria never had the chance to admit she was ill, because in that society, a noblewoman with syphilis equaled moral collapse. All she could do was bow her head, continue brewing medicines, writing formulas in brown ink, as if she were documenting something for someone in the future, when women would no longer be silenced by their own bodies. And nobles often denied everything. When Maria died in 1543, she was buried as a mother of the Medici family. But when modern archaeologists excavated her remains in the late 20th century, her skull revealed severe damage, signs of stage 3 syphilis, a disease that erodes memory, blurs vision, and disrupts the nervous system. A woman who had lived her whole life hiding symptoms, only to die with the truth etched into her bones. And people called her the reluctant nun, but perhaps she should be called the unnamed physician, the one who left behind the most important legacy of the Medici line, a surviving child, and a head that never bowed, drinking wine from a Russian golden goblet encrusted with rubies, a mighty empire, but he died at 34 from partying too hard. Open question, his harem, the second victim. Some empires fall to war, some kings lose their thrones to rebellion. And then there's Abbas II, who fell to his own gilded bed. Born in 1632, Abbas II ascended the throne at the age of 9 after the death of his father, Shah Safi. At 15, he dismissed the regents and took power himself. Under his reign, the Safavid Empire gradually stabilized, winning a few minor battles against the Mongols and Russians. Domestic affairs improved, trade expanded, and people began to call him the just Shah. But for Abbas, justice was not found on the battlefield. It was found in a goblet of wine and in endless nights. The young Shah lived in the Isfahan palace like a 17th century rock star. The Chehel Sotun Palace, where he hosted most of his banquets, was tiled in turquoise and brilliant gold, reflecting candlelight like a sea of artificial stars. The lacquered wooden ceiling was painted with Persian mythological scenes, and below were long dining tables adorned with dried figs, ripe pomegranates, and salted lake fish. On spring nights, the scent of orange blossoms lingered on the king's pillow, mingling with the sounds of stringed instruments played by half-drunken musicians. Dancers giggled behind curtains as thin as smoke, and all the worries of the court seemed to dissolve into the music, wine, and beauty. He drank red wine from a Russian golden goblet encrusted with rubies, a gift from the Tsar. The festivities were endless, with beauties brought to the harem from Armenia to Georgia, from Turkey to India. Instruments were plentiful, so were the feasts. The problem was, no one dared to mention illness. When Abbas began to suffer from insomnia, paranoia, difficulty walking, and sudden outbursts of anger, royal physicians quickly blamed evil spirits or cold winds from the west. They prescribed herbs, prayed, burned incense, but no one uttered the S word, syphilis. In later forgotten Persian medical texts, classic symptoms of neurosyphilis were recorded: paranoia, tremors, pupils unresponsive to light. What modern medicine calls Argyll-Robertson pupil. His facial muscles began to twitch, then stiffened. His hands trembled. his speech lost its sharpness. A few brave physicians, those who dared read Hippocrates or Avicenna in secret, realized what was happening. But diagnosing the Shah with syphilis was a fast way to disappear permanently. The disease was transmitted in moments he thought were victories. In 1666, at just 34 years old, Abbas died in silence, a silence the Persian court was unaccustomed to. No clear cause was announced, but medical records and Persian writings of the time show symptoms consistent with late-stage neurosyphilis. His successor was his eldest son, a quiet teenager born of a concubine whose name was lost to time. And the harem, those women who had once lived under Abbas's shadow, began to wither. Many had been war captives, brought from the Caucasus, India, and the Anatolian Peninsula. Some couldn't speak Persian, had no surnames, and no right to fall ill. When ulcers, fevers, or neurological symptoms appeared, they were labeled unclean and sent into isolation in hidden gardens. No one knew whether they lived or died, and in the chronicles, they were reduced to a passing phrase. The harem was renewed after the Shah's funeral. In a few forgotten secret records, some women were later noted to suffer from strange skin and neurological conditions, but no one investigated. There are victories that require no armies, and there are defeats born from the very silk pillows one rests upon each night. Abbas II, the great Shah of a once mighty empire, died like an ordinary man, exhausted, confused, and corroded from within. The only difference was, he took the throne down with him. After Abbas II's death, the Safavid dynasty entered an irreversible decline. Border provinces began to revolt. The army lost morale. Foreign merchants, who once saw Isfahan as a trade center, gradually pulled westward. The throne remained, but no one wished to sit on it. The Persian Empire did not fall by sword, but by the crumbling body of a Shah once called the Just, once disguised as a midwife to assist with childbirth, lost his nose, went blind, and became incontinent due to syphilis. Died blind, later portrayed by Johnny Depp. John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester, was the kind of man who, if he lived in the age of social media, would have been cancelled overnight. But in 17th century England, he became a symbol of a debauched life, applauded by the crowd. Born in 1647, John was the son of a cavalry hero from the English Civil War. At 11, his father died, and John inherited the title. King Charles II, who loved men both clever and dangerous, adopted John as a political protégé. He sent him to Oxford, then funded a grand tour to France and Italy, where the teenager was exposed to Enlightenment philosophy, satirical literature, and high-class European sex workers. Returning to England, John married Elizabeth Mallet, a noble lady, after a failed kidnapping attempt to force the marriage. He was thrown into the Tower of London, but released after apologizing to the king. And from there, his long slide began in earnest. John became a central member of the Merry Gang, a group of nobles known for partying, drinking, writing drunk poetry, and seducing without regard for social norms. John didn't just sleep with famous actress Nell Gwynn, who later became Charles's mistress, but also fathered a child with actress Elizabeth Barry. He funded her plays, then grew jealous, then left. When not busy being lecherous, he wrote poetry. His poetry, sharp as knives, vulgar as hell, attacked the hypocrisy of Puritans. One of his most famous poems, a satyr against reason and mankind, was not just a mockery of noble hypocrisy, but a rhyming confession of reason's impotence when faced with instinct and strong liquor. Each verse rolled across the floor of a tavern, soaked in smoke, sweat, and the loud laughter of a world unfamiliar with remorse. When Charles II became absurdly obsessed with sex, John wrote a play mocking the king and dared to perform it in front of him. Result: banished from court, undeterred, John returned to London under the name Dr. Bendo, a disguised midwife specializing in fertility treatments for noble women, many of whom later miraculously conceived. John proudly declared himself the cure for infertility. But then one day, his body began to betray him. Mysterious sores, fading memory, blurred vision. Stage 3 syphilis, the very thing he had spread across London, came back to claim its host. According to a physician's diary at the time, countless maids, actresses, and even a cathedral housekeeper began showing strange symptoms: lip ulcers, trembling hands, memory disorders. No one dared name the culprit, but everyone knew. London, 1680, a place where disease passed through mere glances, as long as the glance belonged to a staggering earl with irresistible poetry. At 33, John Wilmot was no longer a charming noble. He was a blind man. His nose eroded to the point that he had to wear a prosthetic, and he could no longer control his bladder. That fake nose, made of soft rubber, strapped to his face with leather and fish glue, frequently fell off whenever he coughed. Servants had to rush to retrieve it, as if rescuing the dignity of a marble statue cracking apart with every fever. His mother summoned a priest to his bedside, who declared he had helped John repent. Maybe he did repent, or maybe he just pretended, like he once pretended to be a midwife. John Wilmot died in 1680. A century later, his poems were still passed around, read with laughter, flushed cheeks, and guilty curiosity. In 2005, he was portrayed by Johnny Depp in The Libertine as a damp, brooding note in the symphony of lust, comedy, and syphilis. Infected, passed it to his wife. She became infertile. Son died young, leaving succession to his brother. Indirectly paved the way for Maria Theresa's reign. Joseph I, the Holy Roman Emperor with a face as handsome as carved stone, was proof that an empire doesn't have to fall to invaders, but to a quiet sore inside one's underwear. He was born in 1678, the eldest son of Emperor Leopold I, and was raised to become the embodiment of light, reason, and the Habsburgs' greatest hope. But Joseph had other passions: feasts, music, and women. At 21, in an effort to rein in her son's wild instincts, Empress Eleanor arranged a grand bride selection. The winning candidate was Wilhelmina Amalia, a devout, serious princess and just boring enough. Before marriage, she was required to undergo a physical exam to ensure her uterus was intact and unused. Gynecological exams in the Habsburg court, which sounds scientific, were in fact chilling rituals. 2 nurses, 3 elderly noble women, and a priest stood witness. They inspected Amalia's body while praying for her ability to bear a son. In an empire desperate for heirs, a woman's womb was no different from national stock. It had to be clean, strong, and profitable. The wedding was a grand spectacle, like an opera premiere. But before the first act ended, Joseph had already snuck backstage. While Amalia embroidered in her chambers, her husband went hunting and dropped by the stables, where fresh prey was always served up by Count Lamberg, a beauty broker who specialized in farm girls under 20, preferably not too obedient. Still, Joseph wasn't entirely irresponsible. He returned to his wife and fathered 3 children. One of them was a boy named Leopold, the Habsburgs' shining hope. But the child died of hydrocephalus before his first birthday. Joseph was heartbroken. But Amalia, she was the one who suffered permanently, because it was Joseph, after a careless encounter with a gardener's daughter, who contracted syphilis and then brought it home to share with his wife. Wilhelmine began showing symptoms: headaches, fatigue, menstrual disorders. But she believed it was her own moral failing, not her husband, who still smelled like French cologne and someone else's lipstick. After months of pain and prayer, she was unable to bear more children. And from there, the empire's future began to crack, just like Joseph's teeth, which loosened due to mercury, the medicine prescribed by royal doctors. He began losing hair in patches. His fingers trembled like dry leaves. And each time he spoke in court, servants had to clean up the vomit. But Joseph insisted on using mercury, not only because he believed in the medicine, but out of the pride of a man who refused to admit he was rotting from the blood outward. When Joseph died in 1711, at the age of 32, he didn't just leave the throne to his brother Charles VI. He left behind a gap in the bloodline, a great dynasty with no legitimate male heir. Charles VI, panicked by the looming extinction of the Habsburgs, had to issue a historic decree, the Pragmatic Sanction, to allow his daughter Maria Theresa to inherit the throne. Syphilis didn't just kill Joseph, it killed the Habsburg male line for over a century. Daughters, like Maria Theresa, weren't barred from ruling because they were weak, but because they were living proof that the Habsburg line no longer had healthy sperm to plant on the throne. A woman inheriting the sacred throne of the Holy Roman Empire, unheard of. European royal houses objected, some sneered, some drew caricatures. But if not for that sore on Joseph's groin, perhaps Europe would never have known the name Maria Theresa, the only woman to ever rule an empire believed to be for men alone. A small disease, a sigh, and all of history changed direction. Stabbed someone over opera tickets. Once served the son of King George II. Died in prison of brain fever brought on by debauchery, also known as syphilis. If syphilis were a nameless nobleman, Sally Salisbury was the girl who invited him into bed, with a charming smile, a glass of wine, and a dagger tucked under her skirt. Her real name was Sarah Pridden, the daughter of a bricklayer in London. She was born around 1692, during a time when virginity was worshipped like a saint, yet paid less than a silver coin. Sally grew up fast and beautiful, a kind of beauty that caused chaos, as she herself admitted. After losing a valuable piece of lace while apprenticing as a seamstress, she ran away from home and fell straight into the streets of London, where survival depended not on thread, but on curves and negotiation skills. At first, she sold pamphlets outside university gates, but that was just the soft criminal cover for a much more profitable side hustle. £0.50 for 1 hour, neat, quick, and sometimes accompanied by poetry. Sally quickly caught the eye of Mother Wiseborn, the madam of one of London's most prestigious brothels. There, she was reborn with a more seductive name, Sally Salisbury, as if no one remembered the torn dress and the cloud of dust she once left behind. She wasn't just a prostitute. She was a symbol. Mother Wiseborn, or rather, Elizabeth Wiseborn, wasn't just a madam. She was a manager, a PR artist, and, according to rumours, a behind-the-scenes advisor to certain gentlemen in the cabinet. Her brothel didn't sell sex, it sold illusion. And in an era when masquerades were held in bedrooms, Sally was the headline act. Nobles, from the Duke of Richmond to the son of King George II, stopped by to be educated in the art of etiquette by her. Sally's wit, charm, and razor-sharp tongue made her a luxury experience, the kind of woman who could joke about her own body while correcting a gentleman's grammar. But dim lights always burn out. In 1722, during a dinner at a tavern with John Finch, son of the Earl of Nottingham, they argued over opera tickets. No one remembers exactly why. Some said Finch was holding the seat for someone else. Others said Sally hated Italian opera. Either way, a knife appeared, and it ended up in Finch's chest. Sally panicked instantly. She called a doctor, cradled the victim as if holding her last chance at redemption. Finch survived, but the court showed no mercy. She was sentenced to 1 year in Newgate Prison, where the walls were damp, the blankets infested, and the dripping water echoed like a death countdown. Her noble friends didn't forget her. They sent gifts, medicine, and money. But none could stop the late-stage syphilis eating at her brain every night. In her final months, Sally whispered to invisible people, laughed alone in the dark, and demanded to see Prince George so she could reteach him how to kiss a lady's hand. Classic symptoms of neurosyphilis, hallucinations, speech disorders, and finally headaches so severe that other inmates stuffed cloth in their ears. They said, every time she screamed, the entire prison shook, not from sound, but from the shame of a body once welcomed by royalty. 9 months later, Sally died, officially from brain fever brought on by debauchery. But later, doctors gave it a more accurate name, neurosyphilis. She died at 33, buried in a small cemetery. No stone, no plaque, only a rumor that she died with a smile, and a biting insult for the judge who failed to understand the value of theatrical art. A prison guard recalled, on her final night, she set up her curtain, wore a torn silk gown, and reenacted the role of opera queen with an audience of rats and shadows. In that moment, Sally Salisbury was no longer a courtesan, no longer a prisoner. She was the leading lady in a London tragedy, where backstage was a cell, and the stage, an unmarked grave, an Irish woman pretending to be a Spanish dancer, performed without underwear in Australia, made the King of Bavaria abdicate, died of syphilis at age 39. If syphilis were a bolero, twisty, seductive, and always ending on a low note, then Lola Montez was the dancer who moved to its rhythm, barefoot, in a slit skirt, with a leather whip in hand. Born in 1821 in Ireland under the name Eliza Rosanna Gilbert, this girl was never meant to live quietly. Her father died of cholera when she was just a few months old. Her mother remarried a British officer, and Eliza was sent back to England with hopes that nobility would teach her obedience. But nobility didn't teach stillness. Young Eliza pinned flowers in men's hair at church, screamed at boarding school, and by 16 had run off with a lieutenant. The marriage ended quickly, but Eliza had already realized a bigger stage was waiting, and it came with a name, Lola Montez, a seductive Spanish dancer, though she couldn't dance flamenco and didn't speak a word of Spanish. In Paris, Lola became a fixture in bohemian art circles. She slept with composer Franz Liszt, flirted with Alexandre Dumas, and drove a critic to death by jealousy. With jet black hair and icy blue eyes, Lola was the living definition of a beautiful disaster. But it was in Munich that she reached her peak and began her fall. In 1846, she met King Ludwig I of Bavaria, a monarch in his 60s who loved art, women, and scandal. When he asked whether her breasts were real, Lola answered by pulling down her top right at the table. It was the most successful audition in history. Lola became Countess of Landsfeld, official mistress of the king, and the most controversial figure in court. She could make all of Bavaria riot with just a wink, firing the conservative cabinet, shutting down the university for criticizing her, and wearing leather pants while riding horses in public parks. In 1848, revolution swept across Europe. Ludwig was forced to abdicate to save his life. And Lola, she fled Munich before the crowds could tear her dress off to use as a banner. What followed was a string of new beginnings: marriages, divorces, accusations of bigamy, suspicion of murdering a lover, and her famous spider dance in Australia, where she lifted her skirt so high the audience nearly struck gold just to avoid looking up. Lola's legendary spider dance made gold miners part with their money faster than when they saw real gold. She stomped, swung her hips, pretended to catch spiders on her skirt, and lifted fabric like she was dusting a fireplace. Melbourne papers wrote, crowds screamed, churches prayed, and the mayor penned protests, all over a single flick of her left foot. But to Lola, it was art. And if art was banned, she would just dance at night markets. She was banned in several places for not wearing underwear, but still made a fortune off the lonely during the gold rush. Back in America, Lola tried to rebuild, giving lectures, writing moral advice books, helping abused women. But syphilis, her final lover, never forgot her. At 38, Lola went deaf, wasted away, lost control of her body and memory. People saw her in the middle of Brooklyn streets, cracking a whip at nothing as if performing for an invisible audience. In 1861, she died quietly. No scandal, no stage. Just a short newspaper line. Lola Montez, the woman who brought down a king, has died. Before her death, Lola wrote a small book titled Beauty and Bravery, in which she advised women to preserve their dignity and avoid men with thick beards and empty pockets. But later pages recounted the time she rode bare-breasted on horseback through a stormy night in New Orleans. Was it a contradiction, or a confession from a soul that didn't believe in redemption, only in the story? A king of literature and indulgence, contracted syphilis, developed neurosyphilis, died of seizures and deep depression. In the history of European royalty, few kings were both scholars and half-finished drafts of a romantic poet like Louis I of Portugal. Born in 1838, he was the second son of Queen Maria II. As a child, Louis tended to be withdrawn and introspective. unlike other princes who enjoyed horse riding and archery, he preferred hiding in the royal library, reading Lord Byron's poetry, and sketching imaginary maps for Shakespeare's Hamlet. No one expected that this quiet boy would one day wear the crown and die in solitude. He was not meant to inherit the throne, at least not until his older brother Pedro V died of cholera in 1861, along with two other brothers during a week of mourning. From a poetry-loving prince who translated Shakespeare and copied love sonnets for his girlfriends, Luis suddenly became King of Portugal, and also the only remaining hope to keep the Braganza dynasty alive, though only in his 20s. Luis had already gained a reputation as a collector of feminine beauty. Court gossip claimed he once made a bet with a naval officer to see who could seduce more noble schoolgirls during carnival season, a joke both lecherous and poetic, where love and Shakespeare were wagered like poker chips. The loser had to rewrite the entire Romeo and Juliet in Portuguese verse. Luis won, and kept the manuscript as a private trophy. In 1862, he married Maria Pia of Italy, then only 14, a beautiful, devout princess who had no idea her husband would spend half his life translating Shakespeare while sleeping with half the National Theatre. Maria bore him 2 sons, one of whom was Carlos I, the future king. But royal affection faded quickly. While Maria travelled through Europe, perhaps to avoid scandal or to find herself again, Luis fell deeper into affairs, operas, and unexplained headaches. By 1887, he began showing symptoms of neurosyphilis, emotional instability, insomnia, tremors, seizures, and prolonged depression. Royal physicians concealed the diagnosis to protect the monarchy's image and prescribed complete silence, which meant locking the king inside a castle with thick curtains and forbidding him from speaking to anyone but the queen. Luis's depression worsened to the point that, during the winter of 1889, he no longer recognized the poetry he had once translated. Witnesses recalled that he tore up his draft of Hamlet, shouting, "I don't understand why he hesitates," then wept alone until morning, as if he himself were the Prince of Denmark, dragged into a tragedy of syphilis with no final act. On October 19th, 1889, Louis I died. The official cause was heart failure due to a winter chill. But later historians believe the death was the slow verdict of late-stage syphilis, the same affliction that consumed his dynasty, his mind, and the poetry of a king who once dreamed of translating Shakespeare into Portuguese. Son of Franz Joseph, contracted syphilis and gonorrhea, passed it to his wife. Mistress died with him, a suicide that shocked the entire empire. One bullet that derailed European history. Born in 1858, Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria was considered the last golden ray of hope for the House of Habsburg. The son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, later known throughout Europe as Sissi. Rudolph grew up beneath two crushing expectations: to inherit a centuries-old empire and to modernize it. But from an early age, Rudolph was a lonely and melancholic child. Separated from his mother at the age of 6, he was raised under a strict educational regime, where emotions were considered weakness and tears were treated with rote memorization. Elizabeth, Empress Sissi, was not a typical mother. She both idolized her son and left him to military discipline. In letters, Sissi called Rudolph her little sad bird, but she rarely saw him. Once, when he was seriously ill with a fever, He was only allowed to see her through a glass window. That emotional fracture, according to many historical psychologists, planted the seed of a lifelong loneliness. Trained harshly by a conservative general, Rudolf grew up like a golden watch with a crooked spring. By age 18, he was drinking, writing liberal essays, and secretly visiting prostitutes. At 23, he married Princess Stephanie of Belgium, a political marriage arranged only after doctors confirmed her virginal condition. They had one daughter together, and never another child. As people in Vienna would later say, Stephanie married a prince and was handed a bottle of poison. Rudolf had both syphilis and gonorrhea, but still slept with his wife in hopes of producing a male heir. Stephanie became infected, and the royal doctors, instead of telling the truth, said, "It's just a stomach issue." She recovered, but her fallopian tubes were permanently damaged. Her childbearing ended. Around the same time, Rudolf's tensions with his father, Emperor Franz Joseph, escalated. They disagreed on everything: political reforms, relations with Hungary, even Rudolf's support for press freedom and opposition to the church. Franz Joseph saw his son as weak and rebellious. Rudolf saw his father as a man who stole both his career and his trust. Meanwhile, Rudolf took morphine, wrote political fiction, and had affairs with actresses. His depression deepened. Public outbursts, essays against the aristocracy, and episodes of weeping backstage at the theatre painted a portrait of a prince falling apart. The court could no longer hide his behavior. He disguised himself as a doctor to enter brothels, published critiques of the church under a pseudonym, and became infamous for brief bouts of madness, once calling court ministers wig-wearing corpses. In 1889, Rudolf invited his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzerer, to Meierling hunting lodge. She still believed in a love like Romeo and Juliet. Rudolf only wanted it all to end. On the morning of January 30th, 1889, guards broke down the door. Inside, Mary lay dead on the bed. Rudolf sat on the floor, blood leaking from his mouth. Royal police quickly covered up the incident. His death was officially announced as an aneurysm. Mary's body was secretly transported, posed as if alive, with broomsticks and shawls. From then on, Vienna stopped believing in fairy tales. One gunshot in a hunting lodge had incinerated the hopes of the Habsburgs. Succession passed to his cousin, Franz Ferdinand, who would later be assassinated in Sarajevo, igniting the First World War. If syphilis had not robbed Stephanie of fertility, if Rudolf had not cradled his mistress into a final sleep, if European history might have turned out very differently. Pranked his tutor, slept with half the aristocracy, syphilis ate his nose, became a royal drifter, died before the Great War broke out. Born in 1865, Otto Franz Joseph of the Habsburgs was the third son of Archduke Karl Ludwig, younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I. If Rudolf was the misfired bullet that derailed history, Otto was the mirror showing what happens when an empire becomes too idle. From a young age, Otto was known for being mischievous and charming. His tutor once cried from being tormented. On one occasion, Otto locked the man in a tool shed for an entire day, then claimed, "I just wanted to see if he could escape like Houdini." But the real rebellion began once Otto came of age. he stormed into aristocratic life like a gust of wind blowing open velvet curtains, racing, gambling, sleeping with countesses, and once bursting into the royal dining hall completely naked. That was when the European nobility started to realize Otto was a problem. An Austrian once said, "People can forgive a prince for being foolish, but not for having his nose eaten off." And then, syphilis arrived like a gift from Cupid. No one knew exactly who passed it to Otto, only that his list of lovers was as long as the Winter Ball registry. After a few years, the third stage of syphilis gnawed at his nerves and flesh. Otto lost his nose. He had to wear a rubber prosthetic, which he jokingly called his backup nose, though the public called it the nozzle of shame. The rubber nose was strapped to his face with two thin cords looped around his ears, making Otto's face look perpetually like a clown at a terrible masquerade. On the streets of Vienna, he earned a colourful set of nicknames, from Prince Gummikov, Rubberhead, to the King with no nostrils. The sharp pain pushed Otto out of public life. The royal family, already used to scandal, decided to send him to Egypt for a year to escape the harsh winter and the public eye. Rumours say Franz Joseph ordered Otto's name never to be mentioned at official banquets, as if he were a stain on the velvet curtain of the monarchy. He returned to Vienna looking as worn as a dancer with torn sleeves. In 1906, Otto died at the age of 41. At that time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had not yet collapsed, but everyone could feel it trembling. His successor was Franz Ferdinand, the man who would be assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914. One wound, one gunshot, one missing nose, like dominoes falling down the hallway of history. From Joseph I to Rudolf to Otto, the disease didn't just pass through blood, but through the throne itself. Syphilis was a quiet inheritance, eroding dynasty and ideals, bodies and politics alike. Otto didn't topple the empire, but he showed that sometimes collapse begins with a rash and one bad decision in the bedroom.